Since it was written over 200 years ago, most of the story of the United States Constitution has been told not in the Congress or in other constitutional conventions, but in conflicts in courtrooms between individuals and the government of the United States. We're going to tell you a story about one of those conflicts, a story told not just with the dry pages of a history book, but in the words of the man who lived it. This is the story of Gordon Hirabayashi versus the United States. In the fall of 1941, Gordon Hirabayashi was a student at the University of Washington. He didn't have enough money to attend school full-time, so he would attend for a couple of quarters, then drop out and work, saving money in order to return to school. Hirabayashi was a Quaker and very active in student YMCA work. Pearl Harbor would change his world. I asked him, "You were a student at the University of Washington when the war broke out. Can you tell us what the mood in the country was at that time toward Japanese Americans?"
Pearl Harbor came quite suddenly. When it came, there was, it seemed to me, two kinds of things that I recall in December. One was the hysterical news dispatches and radio announcements about espionage and sabotage in Hawaii. Secondly, the quick action of the FBI and alien enemy control that had certain emergency plans that they put into action, and they picked up that night and the next day most of the community leaders as the most likely personnel for spies or sabotage. And they picked up others that were on the list, and they had on the list people whose payroll came from Japan, such as Buddhist priests. So they happened to be rounded up too. And then they claimed, I think all told, over a month or two, they picked up about 5,000, put them into internment camps, and then they made a statement that they had surveillance on other potentials as an argument to, from their viewpoint, that the situation was pretty well under control, and something as drastic as a mass movement was not called for. I knew that the situation would be kind of rough. It was rough already, as I was indicating, with against Asians on the West Coast, and with an enemy nation, your own heritage, you're going to run into extra trouble. That was one part of the picture. The other part was the kind of aspiration that I was learning in school about the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, the rights of the citizens, regardless of race, religion, creed, national origin. I took that, I read that, and I just took that literally. I knew these two parts of my experiences were contradictory, but I felt that this is something that we need to overcome. This is the thing that I need to hang on to and aspire to, and that's what I was doing. So I expected it was going to be rough, but and I expected my parents and their generation, the first generation, who by restrictions and naturalization were ineligible. So they were still Japanese subjects. With war with Japan, they become technically enemy aliens, even though they've been there 30, 40 years. So we tried to tell them that, technically you're enemy aliens, this is war, so some restrictions on you is possible. We hope not, but it's possible. You might even be put into a camp somewhere. If that happens, we'll keep in touch and we'll look after your welfare and so on. The more cynical of my parents' generation said, hey, look, if any of us are put away, you're going to be there with us. And I said, oh, no, we're citizens. They can't do that to citizens.
The United States declared war on Japan on December 8, 1941. Less than 3 months later, on February 23, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. Pursuant to that order, military commanders were authorized to create special military zones in the United States and to exclude from those zones any person the commander found it necessary to exclude. I asked Gordon Hirabayashi how he first learned of Presidential Order 9066.
I might have learned about it in a proclamation that was issued. We all know now, it was February 19, 1942, delegating the Secretary of War and the military commanders under him to take whatever measures they felt necessary for the national security. And it was under this overall order that the West Coast Command, Western Defense Command, began to issue about, well, within a couple of weeks, proclamations on various restrictions. First of all, curfew. Curfew included the 3 enemy aliens, German, Italian, Japanese, plus all other persons of Japanese ancestry, which meant it included me. And then shortly after that, district by district, on telephone poles and post offices, were posted exclusion order to leave their homes, businesses, get ready to go to a pickup point to be put into temporary barbed wired enclosures. They called euphemistically assembly centers. And then when the more permanent camps were built, they were moved towards the end of the summer to one of 10 permanent camps called relocation centers. But they were barbed wired enclosures with sentries, guns pointed in.
What were you doing during that summer?
Well, in my case, you know, my belief in the Constitution and my identifying myself as an American citizen kept cropping up. I did not have a plan, you know, when these things were coming, saying, when that comes, boy, I'm going to just fight that. I subscribed to the curfew for upwards to a week. And then, see, I lived in a mixed international dormitory. By mixed, I mean interethnic, international. But I happened to be the only person of Japanese ancestry living there at the time, so 5 minutes to 8. See, the curfew was 5 minutes or 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. You have to be in your residence. And during the day, your movements were confined to a radius of 5 miles. Now, anything more than that, you'd have to get permits. Well, I was right across the campus, so I'd be at the library or on the Ave coffee shop or something with my friends, and all my friends became voluntary self-appointed timekeepers. In about 5 minutes to 8, they'd say, hey, Gordon, it's 5 to 8. I'd gather up my stuff and dash back. Well, one of those trips back, I suddenly stopped and I said, why am I dashing back? And the other fellows are still where they are. I had things to do. And the answer wasn't very palatable to me. Some of the people who did not have to dash back weren't even Americans, but they weren't of Japanese ancestry. Some Canadians, there was a Filipino, who lived in our dorm. And, you know, I couldn't accept that. That was, you know, I either have to modify my belief in the kind of American citizenship that I had subscribed to, or I'd have to subscribe to that and reject curfew.
What did you decide to do?
I turned around and went back to the library, and some of my roommates were shocked at first, but they agreed in principle with me, and nobody turned me in. So until I turned myself in, after the exclusion order was in process in Seattle, and all of Seattle had been moved district by district. University District was the last. At that point, I turned myself in because I didn't want to be a fugitive. And it was during the interrogation by one of the FBI agents getting the record, you know, statement, that he stopped and said, "Say, if you feel this way about exclusion order, what'd you do about the curfew?" I said, well, curfew was a restriction into my home in the evening primarily. That was it. And I said, "What were you doing the last couple of days? Were you out after 8? He says, "Yeah." I said, "So was I. I was living like an American. And unless it became of national security interest to get all citizens in or moved someplace, or specifically if they gave me some personal reason why I shouldn't go there other than ancestry, which is specifically mentioned as not a factor in your citizenship quality, then otherwise I can't go with it." So I said, "I've been living like an American, and so if you're going to put that down as an extra charge for my doing the same thing you've been doing, go ahead." So that was my count 2. You see, I was never charged with anything except my ancestry.
You were taken into custody and kept in jail until your trial?
When we made our arraignment, bail was set. And so we asked, "Well, what would you do if we met our bail? Would you let me out like anybody else?" The judge says, "No, we can't do that. That's restricted area for Japanese." The judge, and I think I'm going to repeat this about 2 or 3 times under 2 or 3 circumstances, because the judge had as a primary assumption the Western Defense Proclamation issued under authority of the Presidential Proclamation or Executive Order is the law of the land. And so that's the law, and it says all persons of Japanese ancestry must move. So I can't just release you out the front door. And, "Well, what will you do?" And he says, "Well, if they put up the bail, we'll release you into one of those camps." Well, for the purposes of the case, that wouldn't have mattered. I would have been in outdoors a little bit. I've been in a more normal population of males, females, children, and so on, whereas I was in an all-male cell, you know, cell block. But it just made me uncomfortable to even take that option. So I said I should be allowed to go out the front door. And he says, I can't accept that. So we had a stalemate. So I stayed in jail all through the wait until about 5 months before my case came up. And when I had my trial, to our disappointment, constitutional questions weren't allowed. The judge instructed the jury, this proclamation is the law. Now it says that all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, all through the war I was a non-alien. You try to define that, you know. It's easier to lock up a non-alien than a citizen, you know. The judge said, that's what this proclamation says, so you must determine whether he is of Japanese ancestry. If he is, whether he obeyed these two orders. Well, they were all admitted by me. In addition, they brought my parents from Tule Lake concentration camp to testify that they were born in Japan, grew up in Japan, had migrated here, had children, one of whom was in this courtroom pointing to me. Therefore, they concluded what I said was correct. I am of Japanese ancestry. And then the jury could determine easily that I hadn't abided by the regulations. And the jury's instruction and the assistant district attorney's last statement to the jury was, you heard what the judge's instructions were, you're compelled to obey them. They were gone only about 10 minutes. They came back with a guilty verdict. So that was the essence of my district court, and in essence, the judge decided to suspend the Constitution, even though we didn't have martial law. I thought I had the Constitution to protect me.
It may be that Gordon Hirabayashi received as fair a trial as one could hope to have received at the time. But the tone of the opinion written by Judge Lloyd Black indicates that not all was as fair as one would hope that it could have been. Here's what Judge Black wrote. The decision of this case must be in light of the unprecedented world conflict which so suddenly engulfed this nation, in the light of this being a declared military area, in the light of the dangers that would confront us if defendant should prevail, in the light of the advantage to this nation and actually to those of Japanese ancestry from the orders and proclamations which defendant attacks. This Pacific coast has been shelled at Santa Barbara, Seaside, Vancouver Island. Ships have been submarined without warning in sight of shore. Sinking has occurred near the entrance to the straits that lead to Puget Sound. Dutch Harbor has been bombed, and a formidable force of Japanese soldiers occupies Kiska Island. Who can guarantee that they who have already invaded the western Aleutians have not since Pearl Harbor been perfecting plans to attack by carrier planes and suicide parachutists the vital Seattle bomber factories, our docks so essential to Alaska's life, the Navy Yard at Bremerton, just across the way. Of vital importance in considering this question is the fact that the parachutists and saboteurs, as well as the soldiers of Japan, make diabolically clever use of infiltration tactics. They are shrewd masters of tricky concealment among any who resemble them. With the aid of any artifice or treachery, they seek such human camouflage and with uncanny skill discover and take advantage of any disloyalty among their kind.
That's a funny thing. It's pretty hard to destroy an idealist, you know. I'm a student. I got a lot of these ideals. Now, I got shot down on what I thought the Constitution would do, but I thought, I got that Supreme Court yet. You know, the main raison d'etre for the Supreme Court is to uphold and defend the Constitution. How could they approve this thing, you know? I couldn't see how they could, so I was just waiting till it got up there. We thought it would be about 2 years. You know, normal process before it got up there. We got up there in record 7 months. And we couldn't even get an extension so that the senior lawyer we hired for the Supreme Court hearing could have a little more time to prepare. And through my disappointment, I discovered that the Supreme Court had gone to war, too.
The Supreme Court of the United States unanimously affirmed Gordon Hirabayashi's conviction in June of 1943. Here is a part of what the court had to say. Whatever views we may entertain regarding the loyalty to this country of the citizens of Japanese ancestry, we cannot reject as unfounded the judgment of the military authorities and of Congress that there were disloyal members of that population whose number and strength could not be precisely and quickly ascertained. We cannot say that the war-making branches of the government did not have ground for believing that in a critical hour such persons could not readily be isolated and separately dealt with, and constituted a menace to the national defense and safety, which demanded that prompt and adequate measures be taken to guard against it.
Well, I was very disappointed, depressed. But I didn't have an option. I either have to give up hope, because the Constitution that I subscribed to since my high school days was part of my philosophy of life, the raison d'etre for living. And I just couldn't chuck it over because I lost this thing, because the Supreme Court that I thought would never fail me, failed me. I learned something in this process. It didn't all come clear immediately, but over the following few years, I began to learn what I think is the essence of democracy. These things could happen to you. Injustices could happen. In fact, I realized that the Constitution, as good a document as that is simply a scrap of paper unless citizens are willing to commit themselves and vigilantly uphold it. And those things didn't take place during the war.
Gordon Hirabayashi never stopped protesting his conviction. And in 1986, based upon newly discovered evidence, he succeeded in having that conviction overturned. Viewed across a distance of over 4 decades, it's sometimes difficult now to remember how much courage it took for Gordon Hirabayashi to stand up against the government when tens of thousands of his fellow Japanese Americans submitted to internment. The Constitution failed Gordon Hirabayashi at the time, and yet when I asked him how he felt about the Constitution of the United States today, he had a remarkable answer.
Oh, I think it's a great document. A lot of people have told me that we ought to get more laws passed so these things don't happen again. And I said, I had enough protection in the Constitution to have protected me back there. We don't need any more laws, really. What we need are commitment by the citizens to uphold the law and the various institutions of the government to uphold the law. If we can have that, our document's pretty good. We're improving it as we go, making it even better, but fundamentally, that's a tremendous document. And I lay my life on it.
Gordon Hirabayashi returned to college, became a professor, and spent his adult life teaching. Yet he taught his most important lesson as a student at the University of Washington. One man's struggle can show us what the Constitution is and what it needs to be. That's the legacy of Gordon Hirabayashi and Hirabayashi versus the United States.